What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 81 of the Book Binge. Yes, that is the correct number. For a second, I was freaking out thinking I had numbered all of my episodes incorrectly since I'm doing Wheel of Time Diaries now, but then I decided that the Wheel of Time Diaries would not be part of the Book Binge. They're just kind of their own thing. So this is episode 81, and this week on the show, we are doing a little bit of a different review this week. This one's nonfiction. I have covered another nonfiction book in the past, that being Endurance by Alfred Lansing. That was a really short and probably really messy video, but that was a review that I did. But this time, it's not just nonfiction, it is also an autobiography, so something pretty much unlike anything else that I've covered on the channel up to this point. That being, obviously, as you just saw, 127 Hours, originally published as Between a Rock and a Hard Place by Aron Ralston. This is a book that is probably most recognizable to a lot of people as, you know, being the book that spawned the movie 127 Hours. I would be fairly surprised if people, at least these days, knew about the book more than they knew about the movie. If anybody knows about this story, I think it's most likely because of the movie as opposed to the book, compared to myself, who actually originally only knew about the story because of the book, and I didn't realize it had been a movie at first when I first read the book until after the fact. Overall, I think that this video is going to be one that nobody watches, but that's fine. I kind of want to talk about it anyway for a few different reasons. One of those being that nostalgia while reading is amazing, and this is a book that I've read a couple times before. Every time that I've read it has been in the month of April, so it just kind of has that connection with this month for me. The first time that I read 127 Hours was back in 6th grade for a sort of Lit Circle pick. We had several options lined out on different tables for us one day for Lit Circle, and we were like, well, you have to read an assigned book, but the trick is that you have like 8 different books that you can choose from, and you can read any of those, so depending on what your interest is. So you're not just forced to read this book, you have several picks, and this was, for whatever reason, one of the options, and I was like, okay, well, I'll read it. And then me and one other kid read it at that point. I actually still have very fond memories of those times. And then the next time I read it was a couple years after that in 8th grade during spring break. There might have been a third time in there somewhere, but I can't remember for sure if there was or not. If there was, I don't remember it specifically distinct enough to say that it could have been any different from the time I read it in 8th grade. I'm not entirely sure, so I'm just kind of going with, I know that I read it 2 times before this year. Otherwise, this is my 3rd confirmed time reading the book, let's say. But let's go ahead and talk about why I love this story and why I think others should give it a try. By the way, first and foremost, if you've watched the movie for this book, 127 Hours, and you enjoyed that, my recommendation is pretty simple. I can give it pretty much up front. You should read this book because you'll get a little bit more insight on a lot of the different stuff going on. But if you haven't watched the movie or read the book and might be interested, let me give you a few of the things that I like a lot about it. So this book has kind of like 3 different types of things going on in it at any given point in time. The story that goes through the entire book, every other chapter, is the sort of real-time experience of the entrapment that Aron experienced while he was trapped between the rock and the canyon wall when he had his hand pinned. Every other chapter goes through a different portion of this. For the most part, like the very first chapter is him going through the experience leading up until his entrapment, and then every other chapter from that point on is pretty much day 1 in the entrapment. So like 127 Hours you'll see is 5 days and 7 hours if you do the math for it. So there'll be a chapter for the first day entrapped, and then a chapter for the second full day entrapped, and then the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and then there will be day 6 when, he goes through those last few hours and then finally frees himself, and all of that circumstances surrounding that. So that's the primary tale that is going on in this book. And let me tell you what, I think it's actually a good thing that these chapters were split up every other chapter, even though some of the content in between and the other chapters, plenty of it in the first half isn't super relevant, and we'll get on that in just a second. The fact that the tension and the experience and the explanations of all the stuff going on in Aron's head and all of that stuff was split every other chapter, I think actually works really well for the pacing of the story. It makes it, frankly, a lot more bearable, let's say, to read, as opposed to what it would have been like if it was just literally just the real time entrapment kind of like the movie is, because the movie doesn't go through pretty much any of the other stuff except for Aron in the canyon. Um, so the movie goes by really quick in that sense. But if the book did that, it would be a struggle to read through the full thing, because it would just be like a lot of that all at once. Just a lot of it's a lot of internal monologuing, a lot of sort of like bits and pieces of sort of like philosophical ideas coming in every once in a while. There is one quote in it that I absolutely adore that I might talk about in a little bit. But the two other things that the story does outside of this main real-time entrapment story is, through the first half, every other chapter goes through stories from Aron's past adventures. So stuff that he did, previous to this excursion, stuff that he had done with friends, different trips up to different mountains, different hikes and stuff like that. In chapter 2, very specifically, there was real time. He recounted the story of when he was stalked by a bear in the Teton National Park, or when he was going to, do stuff in the Teton area. There's other stories similar to that, many other stories with brushes of death, goes through a lot of these, and they're rather brief. The chapters are long, but there's several stories in each one. And I thought that they were all really nice. Like, they were all really good. I enjoyed pretty much all of the stories. There were moments when I would finish a real-time chapter and go into one of these, recounting chapters of, like past excursions. It's just like, I don't really want to read this. But and every single one of those little mini stories that he would start telling in the book, I would get wholly invested in it until it ended and he moved on to another one. I'm just like, but I wanted more, That's kind of the interesting thing about how it's written. But that only happens through the first half, so there's only a few chapters like this. The second half of the book is when things really start to speed up a little bit, because instead of going through past adventures, which actually, come to think of it, actually kind of makes sense, you have the real time. If you kind of interpret that maybe Aron could have been thinking about some of these past adventures while he was entrapped, it makes sense for them to kind of be fit in between during the days. So that's kind of an interesting way to think of it structurally as well. But anyway, as I was saying, in the second half of the book, every other chapter goes through the process of his friends and family and rescue, searching for him, trying to find him. And I think that all of these chapters and all these stories and everything has a great place. In fact, I'm actually kind of upset that the second half of the book, with the process of like people searching for him, trying to figure out where he went and trying to find him, especially, I'm upset that more of that wasn't actually in the film, because the movie was really short. And don't get me wrong, it probably couldn't have been too much longer with the content that it showed of just Aron being in the canyon, even though it could have done a lot more with his internal monologuing and stuff like that. But it would have been too slow of a film to do that. They definitely could have made the movie closer to 2 hours, though, if they included any amount of this other stuff that his family and friends and coworkers and stuff were trying to do to search for him. But, that's just a personal pet peeve, because I had read the book 3 times at least by the time I watched the movie. So that was just kind of me, wanting to see more of that, even if I didn't technically need to. But the thing is, I think that everything in the story has its purpose. If you just want to read through the entrapment story and, the process of the friends and family searching for him, just that alone, you're perfectly fine to skip the every other chapters in the beginning with his past stories, but I still think that those are enjoyable. As I mentioned just before, there are some great philosophical musings that happen every once in a while in the book that kind of break up the action and the feelings of the entrapment as well, that I really appreciated. There is one particular quote that I adore. I'm not going to read it here, or maybe I will. Let me actually find it real quick. Yeah, so it was in chapter 9 on page 209 of my copy of the book. I can't remember what day this chapter 9 was. Let me actually look real quick just to make sure. So chapter 9 was entitled Day 4, Out of Food and Water. So it was like, it was a little over halfway through his entrapment, essentially. But by the time this happened, I think it was actually at the end of the chapter. So it might have been close to day 5, actually. So he was like getting further in there. But this passage particularly made me think, and I really enjoyed it. So here's how it goes. What makes the human brain respond to death with reflection? I always figured people saw images of their family as a way of saying goodbye, but considering what the memories have done for me, giving me a surge of positive energy, smiling, feeling happy, I ruminate over an ulterior purpose. Perhaps the whole life's highlights reel thing is a survival instinct, something ingrained in our subconscious, the brain's final trick in the bag to continue its own existence. I imagine that once adrenaline has failed to engage a successful fight or flight impulse, the flash of memories acts as a secondary reflex, motivating us to keep fighting even when we don't think there's any fight left in us. In the face of an imminent demise, the medulla oblongata kicks into involuntary overdrive and says, "You think you're done? How about all those people who care about you? How about all those people you care about?" And bam, you've got a little more spunk. Maybe that's why suicide seems most tempting when you don't have people telling you they love you, or when you don't care if they do love you. There is no flash. The backup system fails. Maybe that's why our brains store memories in the first place, to spur on a stubborn body when the endgame has begun. I just thought that the ideas and sort of the other stuff like that he was expressing in this passage was interesting enough in a philosophical way that I had to save it. Like, there's a couple elements to it that I don't necessarily say I agree with, but I really like the thought process that kind of leads to that discussion. The final thing that I will explicitly lay out as being part of the good of 127 hours as well is the epilogue, so basically the finale of the story. I love happy endings, or essentially happy endings, where sort of protagonists think about their fortune at having survived an event, or, consider all of the things that they just went through and how that's going to affect them moving forward, reconnecting with family, all of that kind of stuff. I really enjoy that about this book. I think the epilogue alone pushes this from a 4 out of 5 to a 5 out of 5 for me, just because I love seeing that kind of bittersweet stuff like that just a lot. I really enjoy seeing that kind of stuff. Like I said, if the epilogue wasn't written the way that it was, I think it probably would have just been 4 stars for me instead of 5, even though it is one of my favorites regardless. But even so, I just think the epilogue is particularly notable. But yeah, let's move on to some of the bad of 127 hours, because this book is far from perfect, and if you look on Goodreads, it has a surprisingly low average score. It's only somewhere like 3.5 stars or something like that on average, as opposed to pretty much everything else in existence, it seems like, which is, closer to 4 or 4.5 stars averages for some reason, because, reasons. 127 Hours does have some problems, particularly where the prose department is concerned. The actual writing of the book isn't horribly smooth. As I read a quote earlier, I think there are a couple great quotes. There's some great moments in it, but I do think it's mostly for the thoughts behind those moments rather than the actual writing, why they're enjoyable. Like, there were a couple things about that quote that I read earlier that I definitely would not have written that way, and that I wouldn't say is beautiful writing per se. I think it's the idea behind them that are more interesting. I do think the first half of 127 Hours is also a little bit slow, due in no small part to that every other chapter formatting of the real-time story with the stories from the past. But even so, like I said, I still appreciate them for breaking up the main story, because it would just be a lot to experience that much of the main story all at once. But the first half is definitely a little bit slow. This book is by no means anything like high literature, and it might not even be the highest quality autobiography I've even read, but the thing with that is you can tell that Aron wrote it himself. There are plenty of biographies and autobiographies that are ghost written. Like, a lot of the autobiographies that you could read that are out there by certain celebrities or whatnot, there's a pretty high chance that those weren't actually written by the celebrity. But in this case, you can absolutely tell that Aron wrote it himself. You can feel the heart and the rawness of the narration. And I don't think the story could have been narrated by anybody but Nate. Why did I say Nate? Anybody but Aron himself. So even though it's not the best, it is absolutely a favorite because of the kind of heart and soul that's in it, and just because I think the story is inspiring as well. By the time you get to the back half, though, I'm sure you'll not want to put it down, because the back half is just fantastic. In terms of the ugly, though, well, this is a little bit different than normal, because the entire experience of this book is kind of the ugly, whether it be the stories from Aron's past that were like close encounters with death, or the real-time chapters as well, especially when you get to the end when he cuts off his own arm. Like, there's a lot of stuff here that's like pretty gnarly. And if you've seen the film and you know the scene from when he cut off his arm, his actual escape, yeah, there's some pain to be had while reading this book. Although, to be fair, I think the film the film is a little bit more dramatic in that sense than the book was, just in the way that certain things were described. But even so, some of the experiences that are had in here definitely still fit in with being the ugly, you know? But at the same time, going through all of that stuff is really enjoyable for me as a reader because it gives me an appreciation for life that I just wouldn't have otherwise, you know? When hearing the experience or reading the experience or seeing the experience, I suppose, of people's very close encounters with death really kind of makes you interrogate yourself and think about your own history and whether you've appreciated life very much, because you'll always hear, like Aaron himself has said before, that he probably wouldn't change anything. He wouldn't, change anything about his experience. He wouldn't change the fact that he lost his arm just because the experience that he went through that made him lose his arm made him really appreciate life and family and interpersonal connection and some of this stuff in a way that he never would have if he never lost his arm, let's say. So reading stuff like that always just makes me really appreciate it, you know? This is part of why I love the epilogue so much. But now we come to the recommendation. This one's a little bit more mixed than I think most of my reviews are, where I generally just say, yes, please read this book, or read this book if you want to, or something along those lines. But this one, I will go ahead and reiterate. If you enjoyed the film, I would 100% recommend this book to you. It's got a lot more depth to everything, whether it be just the way he thinks about certain processes or the way he explains a lot of his experience, all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't feel like it flashes so quick. The biggest flaw with the movie is that it's too short. Um, Even though it couldn't have realistically have been longer while keeping, the audience engaged. It's just the fact that every single day of those 5 days in his entrapment goes by in, a matter of 10 to 15 minutes at most, as opposed to when you're reading them, for me, each one of those sections of the book takes an hour or something like that, or more, an hour or an hour and a half of reading. So you're actually getting to experience a lot more of that. You're getting more of the depth to it. There's something about that that I think is just worth reading if you enjoyed the film. And it just kind of feels so much more poignant, the actual experience itself. There's a better word for it, but poignant is the only one that comes to mind at the moment, or at least it was when I wrote the notes and trying to think about what I was trying to think of before then. I still can't come up with the right word. But even if you haven't watched the film, I still recommend you give the book a shot if you're interested, though a lot of that is because I enjoy it so much personally, because I have that nostalgic factor to it. It's not a book that I think you're missing out on if you don't read it, the way that I would say, any of my other favorites might be like, please read this, you're missing something fantastic if you don't read it. This one isn't like that. It's not one that you need to read, but it's one that I'd like to see more people read and, have a good time with just because I liked it so much. But that will be the end of this review. Thank you guys for watching. I don't really have much else to say about this book. I don't really have anything to say at the conclusion of this video. Normally I would, go into a whole spiel about my experience with the book and wrapping it up, but I think I've talked long enough. Thank you guys again for watching. I'll be back next week with a review on a rather polarizing classic, one that I think a lot of people have read or been forced to read and therefore have a lot of interesting opinions on, and I can definitely see why. So if you're interested in seeing what that is, that will be out next Tuesday. If you're following along with my Wheel of Time diaries, that will be happening just as normal this Thursday. But thank you guys for watching. I'll be back next week.